welcome to the Maria Liberati Show, where food meets art, travel, and life. This is Maria Liberati. What does food mean to you? Tell me in a recorded soundbite of 60 seconds or less, or a post of 50 words or less. Post it on social media, hashtag it The Maria Liberati Show, and if your soundbite or quotes are selected to be part of an upcoming segment, I'll send you an autographed copy of my book, The Basic Art of Italian Cooking, to you as a special thanks anywhere in the world, and welcome to my audience in the USA and everywhere around the world. We may not speak the same verbal language, but we can communicate by food. A recipe that makes me feel like home, at a country home that is, in the mountains of Abruzzo, Italy, or even in my country farm in the United States. It's a frittata made with fresh chipotle onions, since they're so easy to find at a lot of local open-air markets, both in Italy and sometimes even in the United States. Sometimes one of my neighbors will surprise me with a bag of these little chipotle onions from their giardino or garden or little farm. One day I received just such a surprise visit, complete with a small bag of these freshly picked onions from a couple that had a small farm in the next town, a hop, a skip, and a jump over a few hills from me, and I decided to make a fresh onion frittata. The ingredients are 10 eggs, half a cup of Parmigiano Reggiano grated cheese, 8 ounces of ricotta cheese, 3 fresh onions, half a cup of milk, half a cup of dry white wine, a pinch of salt and pepper, a pinch of nutmeg, and 2 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. Peel and clean the chipotle onions, removing the tougher outer layer. Chop the onions and sauté in the extra virgin olive oil on low heat with a pinch of salt and pepper. Add in the wine and be careful not to brown the onions. Let the alcohol evaporate. Add in 2 tablespoons of water and cover. Cook this way over medium-low heat until the onion has become transparent. Once it has become transparent, remove the onions from the heat and set aside. Next, place the ricotta cheese, eggs, milk, grated cheese, nutmeg in a bowl and whisk together with a wire whisk. Pour into the onion mixture. You're going to preheat the oven to 400 degrees. Place the pan in the oven for about 20 minutes or until the frittata is firm and brown on top. Serve with a dry chilled white wine like Trebbiano d'Abruzzo. As the Italians say, this wine and frittata make the perfect marriage. The hint of sweetness of the frittata and the acidity of the Trebbiano wine. Enjoy. I'm really excited about being able to travel to Australia today through Skype, but it's giving us a little flavor of Australia today. And Marissa has 2 wonderful cookbooks. So delightful to talk to, very interesting. Marissa, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Maria. I'm very happy to be here. We're very far away from one another.
Yes, I know. So, Marissa, my segment today is all about a frittata. And, there's so many different ways of making a frittata. And, in the United States, people know an omelet or scrambled eggs. And, people are starting to know a frittata. In your opinion, what makes a frittata a frittata?
Well, a frittata is fried. That's first and foremost.
Exactly.
Because a frittata, for example, if we think about fritto misto, it's fried. Yeah. It's never baked. And I think even people in Australia and recipes that I've read bake it in the oven because it's so much easier. I think people are frightened of cooking a frittata because you have to turn it over. You have to flip it over. And that puts people off. But a frittata is made of eggs, and I think everybody knows that. And it's really the way that it is cooked that makes it different. It's not an omelette. I've seen recipes for omelette where the whites are beaten till stiff, and then the egg yolks are added separately. It's not that. And a frittata can be plain, although I can't see Italians making frittata plain. They either will put some herbs in there or some grated cheese. Is that your opinion as well of frittata?
Yes, definitely. And I think it's so funny because you mentioned about the flipping over. So you have to really concentrate when you do that. You know, you put the plate there and you flip it over. A lot of people don't like to do that. You're absolutely right.
No, but of course, and that's why I think you can't really make a very large frittata because it becomes unmanageable.
Yes.
And also I can see that you wouldn't use a square container, for example. I know that there are some square fry pans, but that would just be too hard to manage. That, I think, is very, very easy to cook because what one concentrates on is pressing it as you are cooking it. At least that's what I do. And that gets the runny egg yolk to go to the side.
Yes.
And then you lift it. And so the running eggs have the opportunity to go underneath. And you can move it around. And then I think once most of the egg has been absorbed, then you put a plate on top, turn it upside down, and then you slip it back into the saucepan, into the fry pan, and finish it off.
Exactly. And the thing is, I think people tend to just throw it in the oven, as you said, sometimes because it's sort of an intensive, you know, just like all Italian cooking, you know, risotto, right? And some pasta dishes. I mean, you really have to be attentive to it, to the frittata, if you cook it the real authentic way. So I think that, and it's well worth it if you do, you know, as all Italian cooking, right? If you spend time on it and you're attentive to it. So, you know, it comes out wonderfully if you do it that way. But, not everybody wants to spend the time to do that. So I think that's why people just kind of like, okay, I'm throwing it in the oven. But yes, that's absolutely right. Everything you said.
Maria, you make me think about this though, because I grew up with frittata. So therefore, I am repeating what I know, but I wonder if I was an Australian, for example, and I'd never made frittata before, whether I would revert to putting it in the oven.
Yes.
I don't know, and I think one has to consider that, because if one has grown up with that habit, that practice, one doesn't break it.
Exactly. And I do the same thing. I just can't. Like, I've had people tell me to do certain things and, oh, try this. And then you just put it in the oven. I just can't do that. I have to do it exactly just the way you're saying.
It comes with practice, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It definitely does. And, as you said, you grew up with that, cooking it that way and having it cooked that way. I did. So I'm used to being able to doing the flip over, and, you know, I know how to do that. But you're absolutely right. You have to, it comes with practice, and it's well worth it. You know, I think the best thing is if someone wants to try it, try the small, you know, the smallest pan you can get. And,
2 eggs.
Right.
The small pan.
Exactly. A small pan, and you'll be able to get that. So, but you're absolutely right. We grew up with it that way, and it's probably why we're used to doing it that way. So I wanted to ask you, you've said that the cuisine of Italy is highly localized, which we know. When you say that that applies to Australia as well, how would you say that localization applies to frittata?
For example, if I think about frittata and how it is cooked in Italy, for example, I grew up in Trieste.
Yes.
But visited Sicily very, very often, and I had Sicilian parents. And the frittata from the two regions were quite different. Living in Trieste, there seemed to be less ingredients in the frittata. So, for example, you may have a few zucchini or a bit of ham or some sort of salome, a bit of cheese. Whereas I found that the ones in Sicily perhaps had more ingredients, more vegetable based, for example, rather than small good based. And because of the vegetable content, you know how vegetables release liquid when they're fried, when they're in a saucepan?
Yes.
They add breadcrumbs. And I found that quite different to the rest of Italy. I don't know about your experience, but in Trieste, sometimes they would put a little flour. For example, the Triestini and in Alto Adige, which is right in the north of Italy, they have fruit frittata.
Oh, wow.
Yes, a sweet frittata.
Yes, yes. I was not familiar with those. Wow.
Yes, especially apples. And so what you do, for example, do you know about tatin? I can't pronounce
yes.
yes. But you know how you caramelize butter and sugar with the fruit,
Yes.
so that you give flavor to the fruit, and then you put the pastry on top.
Yeah.
Well, with the fruit ones, they do exactly the same. They use butter and sugar to caramelize and soften the fruit. Then you throw in the eggs, the beaten egg. And sometimes, because once again, I think it's all to do with liquid. I've been doing quite a bit of thinking about this. For example, fruit releases juice.
Yes.
You need something to soak it up. You wouldn't just put egg in it. When you have a look at their frittata in the north, especially with fruit, they put a little bit of milk and flour to, I don't know, set it, I suppose.
Yes.
And again, there are quite a number of recipes. For example, the Greeks do too. And some of the French, where they cook fruit, and then they put almost a pancake mixture on top.
Yes.
And then bake it. So I think they're all connected. I've always found fascinating how food in different cultures is connected.
It is fascinating. And the thing with the flour and the breadcrumbs, I know in Abruzzo, so there are some dishes that we do, like pasta dishes and things like that, that it's typical to add breadcrumbs because it absorbs the liquid. But I know strudel, like different kinds of strudel in the north where the apples are wonderful, and that includes the Alto Adige area. They do a strudel, and what they do is they add crumbled amaretti cookies. So that, again, it absorbs the liquid in the apples. And so, yes, that's definitely something to do, because it will absorb the liquid. But the apple, that sounds wonderful. And I guess, and that's local to Alto Adige because because their apples are wonderful. They specialize in apples there, correct? They're local.
Yes. And I mentioned that I grew up in Trieste as a child. They had the Austro-Hungarian Empire ruling that particular region. So their food is Austrian influenced, Hungarian influenced, German influenced. And I think that's where the fruit comes from. The fruit in the frittata.
Yes.
When you mentioned the strudel, the Triestini also have an apple strudel. Instead of amaretti, they fry some breadcrumbs in butter.
Yes.
And put that in, and that adds the crunch as well as absorbing.
Things are localized in Italy, and I think it, as we're talking about this, so it's localized depending on the traditions that the area grew up with, and also what's local to that area, the vegetables.
Yes.
I know you were saying in Sicily, right, which is wonderful because there's still that local feel. But the one thing that I thought was so interesting whenever I'm in that region, like the Alto Adige region, that certain parts, like people speak Austrian and they're still right? A lot of Austrian type of food. I've actually, on my way to Austria, because I just love driving, not driving myself, but I would always drive with family, trip or for work or whatever, but still always having someone else drive with me. Anyway, though, anytime passing through, going to Austria or Germany, we would pass through that region. And yes, I was like so surprised that they speak Austrian, and there are lots of Austrian, I think, with strudel, you think of that being an Austrian thing, and some other dishes that look like they have an Austrian flavor to them. Things with like a sauerkraut and meat and things like that. They're very Austrian, right?
And Trieste. Trieste and pork sausages. Sauerkraut and pork sausages. I was in that part of Italy last year. I spent some time in that area. And once again, the languages that they are able to speak and feel quite comfortable with leave us to shame, don't they?
Yes, they definitely, yes. It's wonderful that luckily, actually, my major I was going to be a linguist originally way back when I went to school. So I can Italian, I can speak because I've lived in Italy and my family's from there. So I studied French and Spanish, so I can speak those and understand those. But the people in Italy or Europe, they can speak a smattering of languages, and it does put us to shame. And they go between the languages very quickly, which sometimes I have a difficulty doing that. Or else, you speak half and half, like half Italian, half French or something like that. I'll want to do like when I'm in France, I'll be speaking French and all of a sudden my Italian comes out, but they seem to be able to do that very easily. So yes, you're absolutely right. Sure. Do you have a favorite frittata recipe?
Yes, look, there's one from Sicily because I don't have any. She died this year, actually, my aunt. I only had one elderly aunt in Sicily left. And she was a great cook, and she's the type who would make pastina for broth and cut it into tiny little squares. She had the patience to do that. Pasta for the whole family.
You mean she would make those fresh?
She would make fresh pasta.
Oh,
she
wow.
Was the only one left. And in fact, one time I visited, and she came out with this, what looked like a loom. It was all these little reeds, and she twisted twirls of fresh pasta on this stick and then rubbed it against this loom so that they came out with variations, so that the sauce would adhere to it, with roughing the pasta out. I have a photograph of that in one of my books. She bought this out because every time I visited, she wanted to cook for me, and she knew I was interested, that I was writing books, that I was fascinated by Sicily. And she bought out this loom, and the rest of the family, there were some other members of the family, nephews and nieces, and they didn't even know she had it. They didn't know that she had this, which belonged to her great-grandmother, that she would bring out to make these. They were like little gnocchetti, little tiny gnocchi. They were rolled on these reeds so that they turned out with little grooves.
Wow.
But the family didn't know. Those sort of usage seems to have, those traditions have gone.
Yes.
As the elderly people die, that dies with them. And I do wonder what's happened to this loom. But anyway, you asked me, I'm sorry.
That's interesting about the pastine because, I've never seen anyone make that even in Italy fresh. Now, everybody just goes to the store and gets the dried stuff. I'm sure it's very time consuming, but it must be delicious fresh. So they must be delicious fresh.
She cooked a frittata for me that was very, very simple, and it was wonderful. Ricotta. This particular aunt and my father's family came from Ragusa, which is in the southeastern part of Sicily. And they eat a lot of ricotta there. They're very keen on cheeses. And And she cooked this frittata, which consisted of pork sausages that she took out of the casing and crumbled, and then slabs, quite thick slabs of, you have inches, don't you? Not centimeters.
Yes. But that's okay. Say centimeters.
Half-inch of frittata, slices of ricotta on top of the pork she crumbled, and then the eggs. And it was the most wonderful thing I've tasted, because it was ricotta that is made with sheep's milk. That is the ricotta that they use for making cassata and cannoli. And it's quite different, milk ricotta.
Yes.
And it was just so fresh. Somebody had delivered fresh eggs to her, and she always has ricotta. And she just made this very fresh frittata, which was absolutely wonderful. I think the best frittata are made out of leftovers.
Yes.
And that's because they have flavour. So, for example, if you make it with steamed vegetables with no condiments, it'll be a fairly ordinary frittata. But because Italians tend to saute their vegetables and have herbs or have garlic, have some sort of flavouring in their vegetables, their sautéed vegetables, the leftovers will make a really tasty frittata.
Oh, yes.
There are more complicated ones, which I think come from having the Spaniards ruling Sicily. And in fact, the one that you found in the Old Foodie with an authentic frittata, the recipe that I gave there, I think is, with potatoes and peppers and onions, a lot of vegetable.
Yes,
Those probably were more popular in more ancient times. I think that the frittatas that they have there, like the rest of the world, I think we've simplified cooking. Don't you think we've done that?
Yes, I think so, definitely. Yes, I think we have.
I really like, seasonal frittatas. For example, in Australia, we're in spring now, and I'm really looking forward to very simple frittata of asparagus. Of zucchini, all the spring vegetables, zucchini and zucchini flowers too. I really like using zucchini flowers in frittata.
Yes,
the
zucchini
flowers. It's spring. Green peas, and one of the things that I like to use now, instead of just using peas as the Italians do, I live in Australia. We have a large Asian population. Therefore, we have some of those spring peas. I don't know what you
yes, they're delicious. They're delicious in a frittata too,
And I like those in frittatas. And that's probably breaking with tradition, because I can't see my Italian relatives using those in a frittata. But
yes, that's also good.
That's simple, for me, simple frittata. Simple frittata made with either a few fresh vegetables, mushrooms. Mushrooms are fantastic.
Yes.
Or leftovers. I think leftovers make excellent frittatas.
Yes, exactly. So you had this article, An Authentic Frittata. Yeah, and you said in that I always like to respect the original ingredients and methods of a recipe before creating my own variations. Can you tell us more about that philosophy? That's very interesting.
Yes, I can sure tell you about that philosophy. I think it's to do with, hang on a minute. Oh, sorry. That was written in 2008, by the way.
Oh, okay.
That article. And a friend of mine, the Old Foodie, asked me to write it. And that was before my book was published. And I thought, when I was contacted by you to see whether I was interested in doing an interview, and you mentioned the authentic frittata, and I went through my blog because I have a food blog, and I couldn't find it there. And I thought, where did I write that? And it was in 2008. But on rereading it, it's just how I feel about it. I still feel like that about it. And I think it's to do with cooking for me is remembering what I have done in the past and respecting and acknowledging that it was right for the time.
Oh, okay.
That I was cooking it.
Yes.
Because of my experiences and knowledge, I can modify it to suit my needs now. So that's what I meant by it, is respecting the original.
Yes.
Knowing about the original. I think we need to know what the original is before we can modify it.
Exactly. I think that's a wonderful philosophy. I love that idea. I think that's so important because that gives you a foundation, doesn't it?
It
The
does.
foundation of, and of the way that it should be done, or the way that it was done, and now you want to try and change it, right? But still try to remain maybe in the foundation of the way it was done. But
yeah. And I was thinking about some of the things that my mother did that I certainly don't do. So, for example, it was very common to soak pulses, beans, lentils, etc., in a bit of bicarb. Do you remember that? They did that.
Yes.
To soften the pulses. I don't do that. I don't do that anymore. I don't overcook my vegetables either.
Yes.
I like crunchy sometimes, and I know that every time that my mother would come to lunch or dinner, I overcooked her beans, and she'd say, "Oh, ma questi sono crudi. These are still raw."
Right.
And we'd all laugh. The other thing is that I don't think I use as much salt as my mother.
Yes, they did use a lot more. They did use a lot more salt than we do today. Maybe, who knows, now I think we're more aware of, but I often wonder, I think the ingredients back then were a little more, were healthier, the way they were, however they were grown and all of that. There wasn't as many chemicals and all of that around. So I think maybe you may have been able to use more salt, or it's just that we're more aware.
I think we're more aware.
Yes, of the healthy aspect.
But certain things that I adhere to, I'm very Italian in some ways.
Yes.
Very Italian. So, for example, I would never make a braise without a sofrito, the sautéing of the onions and the carrots and the celery. I believe in sealing products before I make a stew. I know that some friends who sometimes they don't brown the meat, but they might make a casserole where none of the vegetables, and I don't know whether you call them casseroles. Do you know what a casserole? I can hear your
casserole. Yes.
For example, I had a friend who used to just put vegetables and meat in the oven and let it cook very slowly. She never sealed them. She never salted them.
Oh, wow.
But because I've always done that, I don't think I ever make anything without that basic sofrito type mixture. For example, if I make a soup, I always brown or saute the vegetables before I add the liquid.
Yes, but that, that gives, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was going to say, I do the same thing, and that makes it flavorful.
Yes.
Right?
But so for example, in our Australian culture, our settlers, I don't know how much you know about our settlers, but we're more Irish. We were Irish and Scottish and English. So they were the first settlers. And if you have a look at their cooking, it is quite different from the cooking of the sautéing first, for example.
Yes.
So when I talk about my friend making that sort of a casserole,
Uh-huh.
It was based on the old sort of fashioned cooking that the English and the Scottish and the Irish did. They didn't necessarily saute things.
Oh, okay.
So we're always tied to culture, aren't we? And
Yes, yes,
Australia has a very different culture from Europe.
yes.
Anything without extra virgin olive oil, actually.
Oh, yes.
And I use a lot of herbs too.
Uh-huh. Yes, and those are all important things to add flavor. You know, we were talking about doing a sofrito and a casserole and all, but I know even with soup, I think you probably said you would do that. And
Yes.
if you taste a soup made without that and a soup with that, it's just there's so much more flavor when you do the sofrito first. And
Yes.
so that's why when I do anything, as you said, and you do because you're used to it, we do this sofrito so that it gives it flavor first, and then you add everything. So you're absolutely right. That's so important. But you mentioned something about that you're interested in the cultural, environmental, and economic dimensions of food. Can you
Yes.
tell us about that or expand on that?
Yes. If I tell you that I always buy local as much as possible and
Yes.
support the local growers and
Yeah.
fresh food and in season, and I'm
Mhm.
able to do that in Australia.
Uh-huh.
I look for sustainable fish, for example.
Mhm.
I buy from markets rather than the supermarket because once again I know that the people who are selling it are selling local produce and it's more fresh than
Mhm.
the vegetables I'll get from the supermarket. I
Yes.
think the world has become more conscious about what we buy and what we eat. And I
Mhm.
think we're more interested in looking after the environment. And I know that before you and I were talking and we were saying that we want food that is grown without the use of synthetic chemicals as much as possible. We
Mhm.
want natural food that is good for the environment. And I
Yes.
think in Australia we're becoming, and I think the rest of the world too, we're becoming much more conscious about that. We
Yes.
realise that local food that is fresh and in season is going to have more flavour than something that has come from a long way away in a different season.
Yes.
And when I talk about economic too, I
Mhm.
think that two things. I think that we have to be prepared to pay for things, for food, for produce that has been grown under good conditions.
Mhm.
And that by doing that, we also respect and support the local growers.
Yes.
But the
It,
other thing about economics is that I don't think that everything has to be expensive, that I think that we can cook some amazing food with the cheapest of produce,
mhm.
as long as it's fresh.
Yes.
So that's all tied to cultural, environmental and economic. If
Yes.
we're supporting local, we're
Mhm.
also supporting the economy.
And the
So,
environment, right? And the environment also. So
and
that's
the
what you just
environment,
said. So yes, and also it also affects your health too because it's a healthier way. So it's kind of like a circle, I guess, is what you're
yes, I was
saying. It
just
really
going to
is,
say,
right? Everybody and everything, the earth, the environment, and you benefit because it's a healthier way of eating. So I love that idea. And, so let's see. Well, we've already talked about, I think. So I know we were going to ask you about anything that's Italian Australian fusion, but I know you touched upon that and said that the country's so young, right? That there's really not any kind of fusion cooking there.
no, there isn't really. I think people just keep to their own.
Hmm.
I think I mentioned to you, well, if we have a look at our population, it really is very, very mixed.
Right.
The first ones, as I've mentioned, the first settlers were English and Scottish and Irish. Then we had European, and we mustn't forget the indigenous cultures as well. We had the Australian Aboriginal culture, and now we are finding out much more about their culture and the food that they eat. So, for example, I made a soup today, a vegetable soup, and I used what are called warrigal greens. And they're a form of spinach that the native population used to use.
Wow.
So from that point of view, I am using a little bit of fusion.
Yes.
But we have Greek cultures. They came next. When we talk about after that, the Europeans came. And so you had the refugees from Europe. You had the Greeks and the Italians. After that, you have the Asians. And by the way, the Asians were here. We have the Chinese people came quite early. Some of the Chinese, because we had gold mining. Gold mining, as you did in California.
Yes.
And they came in 1850. Around the 1850s. So they've been here for a long time. But we have the Africans, we have the Middle Eastern cultures, we have the South Americans, the Africans and the South Americans, and more recently, did I mention Indian?
I'm not sure.
We have all sorts of cultures in Australia. And we're also a very young country. And I don't think there is that mixing that has perhaps happened in the States. You're older than we are.
Right, yes.
We still keep the cuisines. I don't know how you would do something with Italian cooking that has some Australian flavors.
Yes, you would have to just add in some kind of Australian flavors. But, you know, the one thing I loved when I was in Sydney for the short period of time I found food, you know, from so many different cultures.
Yes.
And I thought it was so interesting, you know, and yes, it wasn't anything fused. It was that culture's food that I got to experience. So I thought that was really interesting. And I could certainly understand, you know, that it's not fused yet because you're such a young country. So everybody kind of has their own culture, their own food. And, they haven't really tried to fuse it. We're here, yes, in the U.S., everybody's trying to create, you know, putting different cultures to get together, their foods together. I think it's more ingredients of certain cultures, you know, so you may add a certain ingredient that typically is from another culture to another culture's food. That's really, you know, what they're doing here. But sometimes it makes it interesting. So sometimes I think it's a great thing to do, and sometimes I think it's not. It just, I guess it really depends. But, you know, it's just another way, I guess, to have fun with food and just, you know, try to combine different cultures and fuse them together. But, so I wanted to ask you, I know people that I've talked to about Sicily always say this, and you've discussed in the past that Sicily is markedly different from the rest of Italy. Can you highlight a few of those differences? I know your experiences are growing up in both Sicily and Trieste. But can you highlight some of the differences?
Sicily, the produce, the climate, totally different way of life. So, for example, the settlers, we were talking about the Australian settlers and how we had the Irish, the Scottish people and the English. When one looks at Sicily, the food reflects the settlers that have been in Sicily. So you had the Phoenicians, you had the Greeks, you had the Romans, you had the Carthaginians, you had the Arabs, you had the French, you had the Spanish. You also have Sicily in the middle of the Mediterranean. So it was very important for trade route. So Sicily is a huge blend of all of these cultures. Produce is a reflection of that, but also of the climate. Yes. And so you find things like nuts and citrus in their food. There are many, not just in sweets. You have that in savoury foods as well. Because of the climate, once again, summer, grills, many grills. Sicilian pastry chefs are reputed in all of Italy. Oh, yes. As they're stunt there. They have a different way of eating too. I mean, I lived in Trieste and we didn't eat pasta very much. We may have had pasta once a week. And of course, I grew up in a household that had first course, second course. Yes. And fruit. I think things have changed now that you can have a first course as a main course tied to that tradition. The elderly population still is, I think. Yes. When I visit the elderly relatives, they still have first course and second course and third. But now I think things are relaxing and it's quite reasonable to go into a restaurant and have a plate of pasta or ravioli as your main course and only course. You don't have to go through that rigmarole. Sure. But that routine is also an island, so fish is very important. And because of the climate, olive oil, the citrus, the fruit, many vegetables. Some of the, one of the herbs that they use in Sicily that I have not found as much used in other parts of Italy is mint. And that really adds a fresh taste to Sicilian food. Living in Trieste, we used a lot of alcohol. I didn't find any of my Sicilian relatives using alcohol in cooking. You know how one sautés meat, say, and then glazes it with a little bit of alcohol, and that makes a wonderful sauce. Yes. They add water. They don't seem to do that. Broth cubes, for example, in northern Italy, we seem to use an awful lot of broth cubes. Well, at least my mother did. I don't know about your place or your parents, but my mother always used broth cubes, and we tended to use them quite a bit in northern Italy. But the Sicilians seem to have very natural things. I never saw them adding additives. They just relied on the freshness of the food. Wow. And I found that quite different. I mean, for example, the grills, with just a drizzle, grilled eggplants, grilled peppers, with just a tiny little drizzle of extra virgin olive oil. But I do like their nuts in cooking. Really interesting. And lemon peel. Grated lemon peel, for example. Yes. So, you and I talked about this in the past, about sauerkraut and pork and barley and polenta and small goods, a lot of small goods. Potatoes, for example, that I hardly ever ate in Sicily. And as I mentioned, we had soup or risotto or a broth as my first course when I was living in Trieste. When I was in Sicily, there was always pasta, practically at every meal. I don't know why they never get fat, but they don't. Yes, you are absolutely right. Even if they made a soup, it had to have pasta in it. Yes. Everything had pasta in it. And of course in Trieste we had butter and milk and parmigiano, of course. Yes. Whereas they had things grated on top of their pasta. They would have ricotta salata, or they would have pecorino, or aged caciocavallo, totally different cheeses. Yes. And the other thing too that I used to find really fascinating is that in Trieste we used to have radicchio, but when we travelled to Sicily, we didn't find radicchio. They didn't seem to import anything from the north. The south would send to the north their tomatoes, their eggplants, their peppers, because the north couldn't grow them.
Oh, yes,
But
exactly.
they didn't seem to import much. They sort of kept their traditions and their local produce in
Hmm.
their cooking. And it took years for to be able to buy something like radicchio in Sicily.
Yes, now I think when the European Union started, I noticed the different regions would, now at one time it was difficult to get different foods that were local, right, to different regions. And once the European Union came about, it made it all of a sudden you would find risotto in the South where maybe you wouldn't find that a lot. And now you can find a lot of dishes that are not local to different regions all over the place. So I think it's fortunate, but so people get to experience, but it's kind of unfortunate. It's not, that local feeling, although it's still there. But,
Yeah, I think it is. And I think, that all goes to go with you don't leave your life behind, you take it with you. You can't break
definitely.
away from tradition completely. You can experiment, but you respect what you know that was originally and how it was originally cooked.
Definitely, definitely. You're absolutely right. So, Marissa, I ask all my guests this question, and you've been such an interesting guest. Thank you for all these wonderful, interesting facts about Australia and Italy and frittata and everything. But I always ask my guests, what does food mean to you? So what does food mean to you?
I think it means everything. I think I've always been very, very interested in food, always, and my family was very interested in food. And it's a way of sharing, and it's a way of pleasure. Um, um, I've been interested in food ever since I was a child. My parents, we lived in Trieste, as I said to you, but we also travelled down to Sicily and spent 2 months of summer in
Uh-huh.
Sicily as well. So because of the differences, they all spoke about food.
Uh-huh.
There were big family celebrations in Sicily every time we visited. And
Hmm.
when the Sicilian relatives came to us in Trieste, it was likewise. Food was the center of the universe, really.
Yes.
um, and I just take a lot of pleasure in reading about food, in trying different things. It's a way that I find relaxing. I'm interested in different cultures and what they do with their food.
Hmm.
Um, it's a very important part of me. I don't know what else to say,
Yes,
Maria.
no, you said plenty. You said plenty. Those are all wonderful thoughts on food. So I wanted to ask you first to tell us the names of the two cookbooks, the titles rather, and also where can people find you online? Because even though we're far away, we're in the U.S. anyway. I'm speaking from where I'm at in the U.S. We're not really far away because we can all connect online and find your books. I know online. So yes, tell us the titles of your two cookbooks, and I know you're working on a third.
Okay, yes. Now, I do have a food blog, and I've been writing
Yes.
it since 2010, I think, which is a
Uh-huh.
very long time, and it's
Yeah.
called All Things Sicilian and More. They're
Okay, and the you is it all things Sicilian and more.com?
uh, no, that's the title of it. Why don't I send you
Mm-hmm.
these details as well, or are you just going to
Well,
talk to
yes,
them?
no, you can if you want. Yes, you can send those to us because we'll put those on my blog when we post publicity about this episode, definitely. But I just wanted our listeners to hear the two titles of your books and
Yes, yes. Now, both books are out of print.
oh, okay.
And I mentioned, I mean, I've noticed them on Amazon. Some
Uh-huh.
of them are used.
Okay.
But I've been told that they're quite expensive because there aren't many around. But my first book was called Sicilian Seafood Cooking.
Okay.
And I have the rights to that book. And so once I find another publisher, it will be republished.
Yes, yes. So people can find you then on your blog. And is it allthingssicilian.com? Is that, or?
No, it's All Things Sicilian and More.
And more. Okay. So people can just look that up to find you online. Or they could just look up your name, Marissa Wilkins.
Yes,
I know.
No, it's actually not. It's Marisa Ragnola Wilkins.
Okay. Marisa, I'm sorry, say the middle name?
So Ragnola, R-A-N-I-O-L-O.
Marisa Ragnola Wilkins. Okay. So, yes. So if they look that up too, they can find you as well. Yes. So Marisa, thank you. Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Oh, no. My second book is More Fishy Bites, but once again, that's out of print. So they're both out of print.
Okay. So
but you can find information on my blog anyway about everything and everything else.
That's exactly what I was going to say, for people to look for your blog and to find out more on Sicilian cooking and your recipes and everything. So Marisa, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today, and I'm sure everyone really enjoyed this interview. Thank you so much for being here.
Maria, I thoroughly enjoyed it too. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us and listening to the Maria Liberati Show. If you have any frittatas that you want to show off, the frittatas that we talked about during the show today, the recipe I gave, or the frittatas that Marisa Wilkins talked about, take a picture, hashtag the Maria Liberati Show, and post the photo on social media. We'll be gathering pictures and posting on my website in the next few weeks. Thanks to my producer, Britton Roselle, and this week's guest, Marisa Wilkins, and my production intern, Alexandra Krenz. Go to my website, marialiberati.com, to keep up with my blog and the show and my book series, The Basic Art of Italian Cooking. And you can find me on Twitter at Maria Liberati with a capital M, on Facebook at Chef Maria Liberati, and on Instagram at Maria Liberati and Chef_Maria Liberati. And don't forget to post your answer to the question, what does food mean to you, in a recorded soundbite of no longer than 60 seconds or a social media post of 50 words or less. Hashtag it the Maria Liberati Show, post on social media, or email it to me at maria@marialiberati.com. If your answers are selected for an upcoming podcast segment, you'll receive an autographed copy of my book, The Basic Art of Italian Cooking. And we'll send it to you no matter where you live in the world. So anywhere in the world. Until next time, peace, love, and pasta.